Good evening. I am Karen Taylor. I'm Program Director of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York, and I'm so pleased to welcome you all here this evening. This, of course, includes our in-person audience and our online audience. Now, as many of you may know, it is now Archtober, an initiative held every October to promote the discovery of architecture and design. And you can find more information on this at archtober.org. And I encourage you to explore all the special October activities that are taking place this month throughout New York City. Now, we happen to have a particularly splendid event tonight to start the General Society's participation in Archtober. We have the good fortune to have Professor Mosette Broderick speaking here this evening on her recent book, Fifth Avenue Architecture and Society, History of America's Street of Dreams. You will also have the opportunity to buy a copy of this book tonight from Amy, our bookseller from Books on Call, and Amy is at the back of the room. We also have a special display for the Fifth Avenue title outside in our display window, and I encourage you to look at it on your way out, and I want to thank Thomas Donoghue, our window curator, for designing it. I also want to acknowledge our partner in tonight's presentation, the New York Landmarks Conservancy, and to welcome their members here this evening. For those of you who might be less familiar with the General Society, and my apologies to you, many of you who might have heard this a few times before, the General Society of Mechanic and Tradesmen of the City of New York. It's a non-profit organization that was founded in 1785 by the skilled craftsmen of New York City. Today, our 239-year-old organization continues to serve and improve the quality of life for the people of the City of New York through our various cultural and educational programs. These include our John M. Mossman Locke Museum, which many of you can, I should say not many of you, for those of you who are here in person, you can see up there, and you're welcome to visit it after the talk tonight. Our General Society Library, of course, of which this lecture is taking place in, and this the lecture, our library program dates back to 1820. We have a tuition-free Mechanics Institute, and finally, our lecture series, of course, of which tonight is part of, and a lecture series that originally began in 1838. Mosette Broderick is the clinical professor in the Department of Art History at New York University, and is also the director of the MA program in Historical and Sustainable Architecture in London. Professor Broderick's many lectures and publications include Triumvirate, McKim, Mead and White, Art, Architecture, Scandal and Class in America's Golden Age. She has an extremely busy schedule, and we so appreciate her being here this evening. It is now my great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Mosette Broderick. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Karen, and thank you. Actually, you all made this so easy for me, which I will, I'm sure, be able to mess up. One of the features I've just learned about my absolutely marvelous images is some of them are very dense, which means sometimes when I change the slide, it may take a minute because there's so many pixels or whatever it is that's in there to change, but it means it's coming. Don't worry about it. Okay, about New York. How do we describe New York? I think I describe it these days as being motivated by two features, speed and greed. And it is in the 19th century that we see this form. The 19th century takes New York City from being a small burg of not much importance into a place that rapidly changes, and the vehicle for this change was Fifth Avenue. Fifth Avenue acted as a magnet, pulling New York City up a block a year from the 1840s till the end of the century. The wealthy people, or at least the upper middle class at first, built their houses on Fifth Avenue, and the middle class radiated out from the blocks, and the less expensive properties radiated out farther, closer to the rivers. So it's Fifth Avenue that brings everything up. Fifth Avenue is about a great story of conformity and collapse. So I want to start today by talking about Yankees and Knickerbockers. The Knickerbockers were the Dutch owners of the land. The Yankees came in. The Yankees come from New England, and what they found is New England freezes. Son of a gun. The ports at Newport, Boston, and even the river at Philadelphia freeze every winter. The lucky Dutch had a free-flowing port. Even though it was now New York and the Dutch ownership of the properties was still there, even if their imprimatur of nationhood had gone. So the Dutch owned the land, the British owned the businesses, and everybody concentrated on the ship's trade. Everybody in the late 18th and early 19th century was in the shipping business one way or another. You made boats, you serviced boats, you brought in product, you sold product. Everything was about the seaport, and everything was about trade via boats. As the Knickerbockers owned the land, those in Boston and Newport decided, well, we're going to come in because we can be here all winter. And what the Yankees did when they came into New York City is kind of accept the Dutch traditions. They took over the church. The old Dutch church found itself rapidly bought out by the Episcopalian church, but even so, the Dutch customs lingered on. There wasn't much Christmas. Everything was about the New Year celebration, when the ladies of a household would get ready a very heavily alcoholic punch, and all the gentlemen in their world, and their world was about 50 families who were prominent in the ship world and the shipping merchants of the port people, they would come over to the houses and take a cup of the punch, and the ladies would be all dressed up and ooh and ah, and the men would go on and probably be really drunk by the end of the day. But this was the custom of the day. Everything was comparatively simple compared to the way things will be. The big treat in Dutch Knickerbocker, New York, was ginger snaps. The cookie ginger snaps. That was a big treat. And when young men and young women were courting, they would go to the edge of the park or a stoop if it was warmer, and they'd casually dance with each other and socialize in a rather simple setting. New York was not ready for the changes that would come, but we'll take a peek at it here. There we go. So this is the early days of New York in the 19th century, and what we're looking at is a battle of streets. If the city's going to grow, there were two appropriate streets to move it beyond Washington Square. Street 1 was where the Knickerbockers were, which is 2nd Avenue. They already had a good set of houses there, and a lot of the property there belonged to the Rutherfords and the Stuyvesants. Why not go up 2nd Avenue? That's where the city's prominent citizens were. It's 100 feet wide. It's on solid terrain, it's rock below, it's perfectly safe. Why didn't they go up there? Why did another road slightly to the west, 5th Avenue, which was dead empty, but emerges from a park, why did that road win? Also 100 feet wide, also on solid rock? Why did one win and the other fade? And I think the answer was the Rutherfords and Stuyvesants owned so much of the property that if anybody was kind of curious about being a speculative builder, they had all the property sewed up already. 5th Avenue only had the Brevoort family, a prominent family but a family with very little property. They only owned a small portion of the land just above Fifth Avenue. And so the Brevoorts were the linchpin to change the city. This is Washington Square in one of the rare views of it being used as a military parade ground, which was its purpose. And what we see here is the 7th Regiment Army practicing a routine which makes them all look as if they're preparing for a Christmas show of the Nutcracker. But this is what I think was the entire population. In fact, probably flatters the size of the merchants of the port population of the day. Where did they live? They lived in something like this. Everybody lived in the same darn house. Everybody lived in a red brick federal doorway arched house with some dormer windows below Washington Square, below the park. This is the way you lived. Everybody lived the same way. Everybody did the same thing. They wore the same clothes, they ate the same foods, they had the same interior fittings. In fact, if one person went and bought something new, the rest of them had to get exactly the same thing. It was a period and a world of convention. These are the sort of bridge between the old Dutch days and the beginnings of Fifth Avenue. These are the houses of Washington Square North, which are early Greek Revival houses, which have really wonderful features, those doorways and their submersion of the dormer roof as they come across, but they're still red brick. Now, how do you start an avenue? One of the things we're going to talk about tonight is something that I call at least the anchor houses. And that is a real estate idea to plant part of the family on the family property, make it very glamorous, and try to attract people to buy or rent nearby. And so the Brevoorts did just this. Henrik Brevoort built a house right on the corner of Fifth Avenue. He was smart enough to hire the very best architect in the city, A.J. Davis, and he had a very unusual house, a house with a central entrance with a bow window on the side, and yet it fit into the picture of the city houses of the day, major architect of the day, and it was surrounded by nature. One of the interesting features of the city at this time is Lafayette Row, which was being left behind now, had a front garden of 15 feet. And when they opened up on Fifth Avenue, they said, we want every house to have 12 feet of front space so that they have trees and gardens and plantings, and they can even be surrounded by trees and gardens and planting. And so that's exactly what you can see here in the Brevoort house, which lasted almost 100 years. What Brevoort did is move in here. He owned a couple of real estate blocks up. Nobody bought. And so one of the things they did in those days at first was pick up on the idea of the dress ball, a costume party. And they had one. Several people had them. Several of the Dutch families, the Schermerhorns and the Brevoorts, put on costume parties, but there was a little embarrassing incident. A young man and a young woman came to the party intending to elope. Nobody was happy about it. It happened, and costume parties went out for a very long time until we see them resume when New York City transforms into the city of palaces. Did Brevoort's house here work? Nope. He didn't do very well selling off his property. Very quickly, the Rhinelanders came to their property, which you can see on the top, and you can see between the west side of Fifth Avenue at Washington Square, the Rhinelander houses, again, which survived a very long time and only went down after World War II. But you could see the garden behind, and so the plantings continued, and the avenue took a right turn. And when we get up to the next block, this is 8th Street and Fifth Avenue, something very different happens. A new material and a new style. And so all of a sudden, those houses we've been looking at that everybody had that was exactly the same with the red brick and the high stoops, now it changes to brownstone. This is the time when the material from Belleville, New Jersey could be floated easily across the river and become the building material for the next 40 years of houses, as everybody goes from a row house to a brownstone row house. And as they do so, they embrace a new style. The style is that of Pall Mall. the street in London where the new clubhouses were being built, and at the same time, the same style was being used in the huge development of London's West End, speculative development, in areas you and I would say is around South Kensington, Notting Hill, Holland Park, that area. And so all of a sudden you have a house like this, which is in a Renaissance style, and although you can see it looks light here, that's a special case, but they are now being clad in brownstone. Is the interior the same? Yes. Is the function the same? Yes. It's just now fully brown. And the brownstones will move all the way up the avenue for the rest of the century. And as they do so, we see the religious institutions of the day, at least the two most acceptable ones of the day, moving right by the brownstones. And that is the Presbyterians and the Episcopalians, who move to 11th and to 12th Street and build their houses of worship right among the new row houses being built on speculative land. One of the first glamorous houses in the city is this one. This is Hart Schiff, a man who came up from New Orleans. I believe he was actually French-born, and he built a most unusual house with a central doorway. Actually, it looks a lot more like the Brevoort house. And he built it, it was said to have had hot and cold running water. It was a very fancy house for its day, and it was unfortunately fancy and lovely, but poor old Hart Schiff died before he could move in. But it becomes, for those of you who are print collectors, it's Amos Eno's house for the rest of the century, who was the great collector of New York City prints. Now we come up to 12th Street, and we come into another group of people who joined the Knickerbocker Society that absorbed the Yankees, and that is the Scotch people. There is a group of Scotch people who come over in the middle of the 18th century, who move into trade and who move into New York City real estate with a vengeance. And Robert Lennox was such a man. He came to New York in the middle of the 18th century. He was very prosperous as a merchant in the port, but one of the things he did with aplomb is buy a large swath of land from 70th to 73rd Streets, from Fifth Avenue, an empty field, all the way over to Lexington. And when he died, he said to his son, who was a bookophile and very quiet, he said, "Don't ever sell that property. It's a property you and I know today as Lenox Hill." This is the house that Mr. Lennox built for himself, and the addition on the left is actually a second house for his sister. And it is in here that he collected an amazing amount of books and other scholarly material, becoming increasingly a hermit who only allowed his sister and a few close family members, along with the servants, to come near him. It was a very big house in a strange style. It's the only house that has these Robin Hood-like crenellations. Why did he do this? I think he was interested in Walter Scott. This is the period of the Waverley novels. The Scottish families of Washington Square were interested in the same. So I think that's what he was thinking. But why did he do it this way? I think also because New York University had just built its first, the University of the City of New York, it called itself then. They built their first building at what is Washington Square's east corner, where they are today, in a different building. And I think he hired that architect because Lennox's houses bear no resemblance to the Presbyterian church he built across the street, but which is very different in style. So probably it's the NYU architect, a man called James Dakin, who will promptly transport himself to the American South, but I think he built the Lennox houses. Lennox worried about his collections as he got much older. What is he going to do with them? What's going to happen? And so he is going to create the Lennox Library, one of the great learning institutions up on his Lennox Farm property, and we will see it in its short life when we get up to 70th Street. So now, how does the city begin to move forward with the speed I thought about? Well, I spoke about. One of the reasons is this guy. This is a man called August Belmont, who comes to New York City to represent the Rothschilds in 1837. He's on his way to Cuba for them. But as he gets to New York City and kind of smells the activity around Wall Street at the Merchants Exchange, he said, I'm not going to Cuba. I'm staying here. And I'm trying to work out a deal, which he did succeed in doing, with the Rothschilds so that he can be his own man and have his own investments while representing the Rothschilds in New York. August Belmont knew European customs. It is said he drank wine. It is said he had the first butler and French chef in New York City. It is said he was determined to make himself a major part of New York City life, and that he would do. In order to facilitate this, he would need a proper wife. And he managed to marry a remarkable woman who's of the Perry family, who were going to, in 4 years, open up Japan to Japanese trade. And he marries Tiny, as she was called, Belmont, a wonderful young woman who was very careful and very proper in society and highly regarded by people, as she was a kind of a decent person. And Belmont built a new house for her, a double house. I never understood why. Why does it have those two doorways? It's by an English architect who's come to New York now, who was a kind of classy architect for the day. Why did he build this double house this way? I don't know. But we do know that he lived in it, filled it with pictures, pretty much all of them bad. They were in the ballroom to the back. It's one of the first known picture galleries and ballroom in the New York City area. And he managed to get himself as a major player in New York City's financial world and New York City's world by his marriage to lovely Tiny Belmont. And one of the things he did say to her, you know, what you did in those days is you bought beautiful gowns. Worth is coming in, the great English couturier in Paris is coming in to the notice at this point. And what the New York Knickerbocker women would do is they'd buy, and it was the custom, was you'd put the dress in its box for a year or two, and then you'd actually wear it. And Belmont is the one who says, oh no, you're gonna wear all this new stuff now. Well, they liked her. She was nice. They liked her, she was pretty, but by the 1860s there are problems, and Tiny Belmont moves out of being the sort of major figure in New York City society. Her daughter was quite ill. Her daughter will die, I think it was a cancer case, and so she retires from New York City's prominence by the end of the Civil War. New York City is going up Fifth Avenue with its brownstones, a block at a time, until it runs into this. This is a commercial establishment, a hotel, a Fifth Avenue hotel, the first grand hotel since the Astor Hotel 20 years earlier and way downtown. So a grand hotel on Fifth Avenue at 23rd Street. It was said it cost $1 million, probably about half of that, but it was a grand hotel which even had bathrooms in the rooms. Suites had baths. That was very unusual for the day. So it was a pretty grand hotel. And it's kind of interlude in the middle of the Fifth Avenue development because the hotel brought in telegrams, all sorts of activities. In fact, Edward VII, when he made the first royal family's visit to New York, he stayed here. Charles Dickens stayed here. So it brings in an era of commercialism to the 23rd Street area, which the householders didn't like. So New York kind of skips over it. It will lead to the lofts that are built there at the end of the century. But it goes up. And in the Fifth Avenue Hotel, the custom was that all guests staying in the hotel got to have 4 meals a day at the long table so that you met the other people in the hotel, and you could bring a guest. So the Fifth Avenue Hotel was the classiest place in the city for a long period of time if you were coming in for a shorter stay. Now, one of the unusual features is that this figure doesn't actually live in Fifth Avenue. This is the next important person. This is Leonard Jerome. Leonard Jerome comes in from Brooklyn. He makes a fortune in a very good stock investment in 1859. It is said he is a stockbroker. He wasn't. He was a gambler. And he had one really big hit in 1859. And with that hit, he built that. And it's not a brownstone. It's not a red brick house. It's not even on Fifth Avenue. It was over on Madison Avenue. And it's a brick house with an amazing amount of cast iron detail. What did that stuff do? Told everybody you were rich. Why did you have that cast iron? It's not a porch. You can't go out there. It shades the interior rooms in the summer a little bit. But what was that all about? It's like driving your Maserati and parking it in front of your house. It was a sign of great wealth. And so what he does here, he has that famous stable. He loved women singing opera arias and horses. And he built a stable just beyond the house there. And in the stable at a party, it was said that there were two fountains. One fountain spewed champagne, the other fountain spewed perfume. It is said that the quarters for the horses were nicer than the quarters for the people, and that is why his wife and their 3 daughters pick up and move to France initially, and then to England. And you all will remember that his middle daughter becomes Jenny Jerome, married to, of course, the 8th Duke's brother, 8th Duke of Marlborough's brother, and thus is the mother of Winston Churchill. Clubs. The first clubs were in brownstones. Brownstones were often rented for all sorts of purposes. You built one, you didn't necessarily stay in it, you often rented it out. And so clubs begin in New York City in the 1830s and 40s, and they rent brownstones. But brownstones and brick row houses are not exactly convenient for having a club. If you've got the dining room and you've got to have a bathroom, the bathroom's right by the dining room, it wasn't very nice. And so the first purpose-built club is the club you see here. This is the Union Club, and that club has chosen to establish itself on Fifth Avenue. So here you see 21st Street and 5th, a club that resembles the clubs of Pall Mall, a club that is a brownstone Renaissance revival, fully fitted out club as a purpose-built place for the gentlemen of New York City. You can see how bucolic Fifth Avenue is looking down the street. It's also a place where the new restaurant business might come. Delmonico's, which starts in Lower Manhattan, has 3 homes on Fifth Avenue, hopping up as New York City did. How long did people live in their houses? 20 years. Every 20 years, people hopped up to the next area. And so Delmonico's starts in Upper Manhattan on 14th Street. It goes to 26th Street. This is 26th Street, and then 44th Street. So Delmonico's hops up Fifth Avenue too. But this is Fifth Avenue. It's all brown. It's all brownstone. There's even a problem when the major Presbyterian church of the day, known as Brick Church, decided to go into the domestic area where all its members were living in their nice brownstones. And the architect who did this had a terrible problem. He wanted to use brownstone, but it's Brick Church. And so he suffered doing as much brick as he could in the brownstone body. This church stays with some notable interiors, you all may know, until the early 20th century when it hikes up to 93rd and Park Avenue. What you could see is the similarity of the houses of the area. Everything is the same. When you go to buy your latest goods, you are still part of the convention of the day, and everybody follows you. The chandeliers come from a certain person in Paris. The fireplaces come from a place in Leghorn in Italy. Everybody wants the exact thing. You want to be equal. You want to be part of the scene. And so everybody does exactly the same thing, and they're exactly the same houses. In fact, it was said that if you had too much to drink at night and you came home from a club, let's say, and you lived on one of those blocks and you went up the stoop and you went to the wonderful mahogany, thick mahogany doors with their silver fittings, the doorknob and the hinges were all silvered, and you'd ring the doorbell and the person who answered it would say, "Sir, you live next door." The houses were that close to each other. Okay, so Tiny Belmont has gone off the stage. What's going to happen now? Well, this is a time when women actually move forward. They move forward as creators of a society because they now have 2 great things. They're richer and increasingly rich, and by the end of the Civil War, they are becoming really rich, and they have servants. There are lots of immigrants coming into the port who are terrific for building the houses and terrific for working in the houses. And so the women now have far more spare time. There even are some inventions that is making taking care of a household easier to do. And as a result, the women have time to think about creating a new world in which they can run some of the events. This is Caroline Schermerhorn Astor. She is a Schermerhorn. She and Mr. Astor met down in Lafayette Street when that was briefly the area to live. They made a marriage. It was a very bad one. He was the second son, which means he was expunged from the family business. He was evidently smart, went to Columbia College. He and Caroline Sturmhorn had nothing in common. They produced a few children, and then he set off for yachts, women, and booze. Caroline stayed home. She said yachts made her seasick, and yet even if she was seasick, she went to Paris every spring with the women of her class, where they had a group called the Faubourg Saint-Honoré in Paris, which included many of the people who lived on Fifth Avenue. She was bored too. Children were growing, he'd fled. She had a house, and this is an anchor house. What the Astor family did is just what we saw the Brevoort family do, and what they did is purchase some property. This property went from 27th Street on Fifth Avenue up to 34th Street on Fifth Avenue, and then proceed west. And in order to develop the property, what they did was put the grandchildren, the two grandsons, on either corner. John Jacob on the 33rd Street side, William Backhouse on the 34th Street side in this house. A little wider, a little nicer, with a particularly nice garden between the two brothers' houses. And it worked. The houses down the street here are rentable properties. People rented the houses, and so the idea of the anchor house with the Astors in it was a very good idea in the 1860s. One day, Caroline woke up to this. Sarsaparilla Thompson. He was the creator of a beverage, of course, sarsaparilla, and he built this extremely ungainly house across the street, which she had to endure. Luckily for her, very quickly, the sarsaparilla business failed, and he sold the house. And he sold the house to a merchant from Lower Manhattan who really owned a lot of property, a man called Alexander Tommy Stewart. And Stewart's wife was part of the same set that Mrs. Astor had been, but he wasn't. He was a very good businessman. He had the most promising store in the city at the time. He also bought a lot of real estate. In fact, some of you may know General Grant picked him as his first Treasury minister, only to have so much flack about his presence that he had to withdraw by the next day. Stewart built himself a house on the north side of 34th Street, again, just across the street from Caroline. Why exactly he did that is rather unclear. He built a very, very substantial house with 7-foot walls, with thick walls that were from Stony O'Neill, owned a little stone quarry up in Tuckahoe, New York, so he had his own stone, and he built this very thick house, and it was kind of a funny thing to do, because it's he and his wife, who was somewhat reclusive, and they had 2 or 3 children who did not survive infancy. So what was this big house about? It was the center of New York. What we're looking at now is one of the great moments, a great event going up Fifth Avenue because of the rock underneath, so it can do this. And what we're seeing is the General Grant funeral as everybody comes up the avenue past John Jacob Astor's house over here and Caroline Sturmhorn's house here. And so they had a wonderful view. They were in the middle of the city. This was a very important thing. And as Mrs. Astor would say, I bought my carpets from Mr. Stewart, but I would never invite him over to walk upon them. Why did he do the house? Well, I think what he intended to do in the early 1870s, when we had no sign of a museum to yet appear, he bought pictures. Believe it or not, Stewart, uneducated of course, had an excellent eye, and he bought wonderful fabrics when he would travel every year to put into his store, but he also bought very good art, including American good art. Most people at this point, Belmont, Mrs. Astor, those people didn't buy American pictures. Stewart bought American pictures, the slave of the Hiram Power slaves here. He bought very good stuff. And what I think he intended to do in his wonderful art gallery within that house is leave this to New York City one day as a museum, but then the Metropolitan Museum was born and it didn't happen. In the end, the house became a club and didn't last very long at all, despite its huge strength and the difficulties of demolition. Okay, back to Mrs. Astor. Here she is in her portrait done by Carolus Durand in Paris. This is where she would meet people and greet people when she would have her January parties in her ballroom in the back of the house. Into New York City had come a man called Ward McAllister from Savannah. He briefly had a well-to-do wife, but that fails. He has taken himself to Europe and he's learned all the affected things he possibly could. He's become an expert on frappes. Frappes, he's learned what that means. He's an expert on Madeira, the wine that traveled around the world. He's become an expert on dancing. He's become quite the bon vivant. And when his wife's fortune is wiped out by the Civil War, what he does is put himself into business as the society director for New York City. Maybe for all of America. But as society director, he had a little problem. He didn't have a big house, didn't have a big reputation, didn't have any money. Oh, but there's the sallow-faced Mrs. Astor. Maybe he can tie her in. And so with Mrs. Astor, Ward McAllister sets up the Patriarchs, the first really exclusive, keeping everybody who isn't part of the Merchants of the Port Society, as defined by Ward McAllister, out. And they had a fairly good 20-year run. Ward McAllister thought he knew how everybody should behave. And this is a wonderful humor piece where you see Ward McAllister with ass's ears showing Uncle Sam a model of how people should dress and behave. And Uncle Sam is laughing hysterically. Although the early parties might have been in Mrs. Astor's house, they would soon be held in Delmonico's. And getting into these events would be a big problem for the newcomers to New York City. Following the Civil War, we begin to have people come to New York City who aren't merchants of the port. They've got nothing to do with the Knickerbockers. They don't know anybody. They don't know the customs. They wouldn't know a ginger snap if it walked up and shook their hands. They really don't know what's going on, but they want to be included. And now we have the Wars of the Women. One of the most aggressive of the women is Marietta Stevens, who we see as Queen Elizabeth I here in this portrait. It is said she was statuesque. She was the daughter of a grocer from Lowell, Massachusetts, but she comes here as the wife of the man who ran the Fifth Avenue Hotel, an interesting guy. And she wants to be part of this scene, and she is not. And so what she ends up doing is taking her green-eyed daughter, Minnie, who you see on the other screen, to Europe and presenting her as a rich American dollar princess, one of the first. She's got nice green eyes, she's somewhat pretty, somebody will marry her surely, and it was a very difficult sell. One Frenchman was even interested enough in Minnie to send a representative over here to check the claims of their wealth, and found their wealth was greatly exaggerated, and the marriage didn't take place. But finally, in the late 1870s, Marietta marries Minnie off to a minor English aristocrat. And at this point, that's enough to get her into Mrs. Astor and Ward McAllister's group. In fact, Tiny Belmont, just after the death of her daughter, goes over and pays Marietta Stevens a call to show that she's made it into New York. Now, what's happening? We're still going a block a year up the avenue. And so here we are at 42nd Street. And what we're looking at is the wonderful granite and gyptoid Croton Reservoir, which kept the water of New York City safe for the first time. It was the very top of the city. And as you can see here, it was a place where people walked to see all of the city below. It's brick just below. You can see the brownstones everywhere you look. And what you're seeing is New York City becoming a little more active socially. By the middle of the century, we see a funeral here, and we see people walking up Fifth Avenue. Very quickly, this will give over to the famous Easter Parade. And here we see the grand men of the city in their high hats walking northward past the Croton Reservoir towards 42nd Street. And here's where we are. The city is below. There's the Croton Reservoir. There's the very brief New York City Crystal Palace. And what we're looking at below is the city as it existed. That's where we are. Still all brownstones, still all the same, but it's about to change. Now, here we are in the 40s, Mimi. This is the house of Jay Gould, the scourge of Wall Street, who had a particular taste and bought the house of the man across the street, a former mayor, so he got to keep the lanterns. In New York City in the first 100 years, every time you were a mayor, you were given a pair of lanterns to sit outside your row house doors. When Updike, the mayor, died and Jay Gould bought the house, he didn't take down the lamp stanchions. He kept them up, even though he was not the mayor. This is one of the longest houses to survive, one of the only ones. Here's the Wendell House, same thing. These houses, believe it or not, survived into the early 20th century, but everything else was gone. So they're going uptown a little faster. It's still a block a year mainly, but what we're looking at is the laying out of Madison Avenue, and you can see the irregular terrain, the rocks, the squatter shacks. Upper Manhattan was not easy to conquer. And there's Madison Avenue being created in the emptiness and zone of bad rocks. But what we're doing is going towards 57th Street, where we're going to see another anchor property. Up at 57th Street, we are going to see the house of Mary Mason Jones, who does the anchor story again. Mary Mason Jones' father bought a little property which you and I would call Midtown. Fifth Avenue in the 50s and early 60s, all the way to left. He bought a huge property for it was $5,000 in 1835. But it was empty, it was farm, nobody used it. But in the late 1860s, Mary Mason Jones and her sister decided that they're going to go and plant themselves on the top, or in fact, actually the middle of their father's property, and build very grand Parisian houses. Yeah, because they were part of that Faubourg Saint-Honoré set. So they wanted to build in a French style. And this is Mary Mason Jones' house. She was very corpulent. And it is said she didn't like to get up much. So what she did is build this wonderful white French high-roofed house and build a whole bunch of rental properties next to it, and then down the streets. So she was the anchor person to sell off individual units along the way. And it is said she sat in her window here and waited for New York City to catch up with her, which it did. The visitors at first had to go buy goats, rocks, little wooden sheds that sold soda water and cigars. It was rough territory. But she was a major figure in New York society. She is Mrs. Mingott in Edith Wharton's novel. She is grand enough to be visited, even if she's all the way up there. By the way, by the time she finishes New York City, by the time she passes away, New York City catches up with her. So this actually works, although the rental properties in the area behind her house didn't. Her sister did this set of row houses 2 blocks away. This is 55th Street, same idea. She built an anchor house for herself, and her rental properties did a little bit better than her sisters had. But even so, they created residential properties at 59th Street well before New York City got there. This is 54th Street, and as you can see, it's dead empty. On the right side is St. Luke's Hospital, and on the left side is a peculiar house by a man called Williams, about which we can figure nothing. Here it is. Why in the world he built this house in the 1860s, well above the city? Way in the back there, you can see 42nd Street. See how far north this house is, 54th Street, just west of Fifth Avenue. And the house had 4 sides of windows, everywhere you looked. He also had a little gazebo and a little land and a little of all things stable right on what's going to become Fifth Avenue. That shows he had no idea of the future development of the avenue. Why he built this, what this was about, nobody knows. But in the 1870s, a woman from Mobile buys the property. She's called Arabella Worsham, and she claims to be a widow with a young son. She actually was the mistress of Collis P. Huntington, and he is probably the father of the son. But there was a problem. Collis Huntington had a wife. And so I think he arranged to give her the money. She bought the house. I think he gave her the money to do it, because if he came up to visit, nobody would ever see that, because nobody lived here. And so Arabella and Collis and their son lived in this house for a while. Eventually, she will trade the house when Mrs. Huntington has the grace to disappear. She dies in 1880, at which point Huntington marries Arabella and formally adopts the child, who was his child, I think, anyway. But at this point, he builds Arabella a new grand house, actually pretty ugly, on 57th Street on the site of what is modern Tiffany's. So they don't need this house anymore. And so again, in a real estate transaction I don't really understand, she trades this house with, of all people, John D. Rockefeller Sr. John D. Rockefeller Sr. has been living in a hotel on what is today Saks Fifth Avenue's property, but he decides he's in New York enough, he'd better do something more permanent and bring his family in from Cleveland for at least the winter. And so he trades this property and moves his family in. And what was incredible to me about this is he doesn't change a thing. Now, you all remember that J.D. Rockefeller Sr. was a devout hard-shell Baptist. He wouldn't let his only son go to the schools other boys of his ilk went to, because he might meet an Episcopalian woman who liked to dance, which he did, but that's beside the point. So what is amazing to me is he did not change Arabella's interior. This is the house of a kept woman with an illegitimate child, and he doesn't do a darn thing. Just leaves it, and the house is in perfect Arabella state until 1925, when Mrs. Rockefeller dies. The house is closed up and demolished, as Rockefellers always did. In those days, they tore down the house. But luckily for us, this wonderful room is in the Brooklyn Museum. Okay, we're still going up Fifth Avenue. What do we see when we go up here? All of a sudden, there's a farm. Why in the world is there a farm? You've got St. Patrick's across the street, and there's a farm in the middle of this. What's it still doing there? What's going on? Well, it's a farm that is across the street from Madame Restel. Madame Restel was the society abortionist of the day. She had residential premises in her house. No one wanted to live near Mrs. Restel. Now, thanks to Mr. Comstock, about whom we're hearing a lot these days, Madame Restel was arrested for performing these abortions and is said to have killed herself in her bathtub. In any case, she disappears, at which point William Henry Vanderbilt, son of the Commodore himself, swoops in, buys the farm, and takes his family up there and creates what you and I would call Vanderbilt Alley, starting with a large double and triple house for himself, his daughter-in-law Alva, the rest of his daughters, all the way up to his son Cornelius. We see the Vanderbilt houses built 1879, almost overnight. It is said that they had 600 workmen working on the exterior sculpture. It's of course not true, but an enormous number of workforces creating these immensely important houses. This is Alva Smith Vanderbilt's house. She follows Marietta Stevens as the next woman who's going to bash her way into society. She builds a white Loire chateau on Fifth Avenue. She allowed a lot of publicity to go on about it. Everybody wanted to see it. It was said to have gold fixtures. And so she had a big party, a big ball. Costume parties are now allowed again because Victoria's court has allowed them. And so she has a big costume party. And here she is in a Venetian princess attire as a painting from Cabanal. And she decides she will crash society and propel herself and her less willing brother-in-law and sister-in-law into the groups that have excluded Vanderbilt. This is her brother-in-law, Cornelius Vanderbilt, too. This is his wife, Alice Gwynn. She came to the ball dressed as a Statue of Liberty with the brand new electric light bulb in her hand instead of a flame. These parties just were magical. People didn't know about, there were no movies, people didn't know about stars, people didn't know about celebrities, but they knew about rich women. And the wonderful parties they gave because, of course, everybody gossiped. And the newspapers, their best-selling features of the newspapers were stories of the ball last night, tactfully given by the hostess perhaps, if not paid-off servants gave the details. So everybody knew exactly what was going on. And people with a lot of money, like this poor little fellow with his very angry wife, are trying to literally force pickaxe their way into society. It isn't going to work. Alva produces a daughter, 2 sons and a daughter. This is the wonderful Consuelo. What Alva did to Consuelo is put her in a steel corset, The steel corset forced her neck northward, and while she was getting her neck fixed every morning, she was tutored in French and German and poetry. She was the perfect, trained by Alva, marriage bait for a really important wedding. She was quite beautiful. Her neck worked. And the fact that her father would make a $3 million check to her husband the morning of the wedding worked too. She marries the 9th Duke of Marlborough, who needed the money very badly to keep Blenheim going. It's a very unhappy marriage. This is a picture by Sargent, which is in the dining room at Blenheim. It shows the heir and the spare, and it shows Consuelo, who the minute the heir and the spare and the coronation of Edward VII was over, fled to France for a different life. We're looking here at the wedding. Everybody knew the details of the wedding because everybody in New York followed it, and the gossip told them every detail about her trousseau, her wardrobe, etc. Nobody managed to mention the fact that she sobbed through the whole wedding. She had a boyfriend. The 9th Duke had a girlfriend. This was a very unhappy day. It doesn't last. And we see New York turning out to see this almost royal wedding. Alva's pulled it off, but she's divorced Mr. Vanderbilt. And everybody at the wedding in New York seemed to have come, except any Vanderbilts. They were not to be found. The marriage was unhappy. Alva was unhappy. The family was unhappy. Curiously enough, Alva and Consuelo would go on to become rabid suffragettes. Alva, the suffragettes headquarters in Washington, D.C., was paid for by Alva, who is now Alva Belmont, but that doesn't matter. She has done it. They changed their mind, forget society. They've now decided suffrage is the cause. Here we see the houses of the Vanderbilts, really quite splendid. Vanderbilt Alley, you can see the detail. In a couple of years, a very short period of time, William Henry Vanderbilt sent his agents, and they bought everything that was expensive, that wasn't nailed down. And we come up with this. This is the wonderful vase, Demidoff vase that had been in Florence, which is now in the Metropolitan Museum, thank goodness. But it was in the air court. It was in the area where you come into the Vanderbilt house. And this is my favorite bit of a joke. Admiral Perry has now opened up trade with Japan, and we misunderstand Japan fairly well. We don't do a very good job with Japan. And so in this room in William Henry Vanderbilt's immense house, we have the Japanese room. Now, I hope there's nobody here from Japan who will be quite sick looking at the aesthetic of how we thought Japanese rooms should look. The son, the main heir to the Vanderbilt fortune, was Cornelius II, who we just saw in his costume for the party. He built a house on 57th Street with entry on the side street, entry on 57th Street, but it goes around the corner. There were other houses just beyond it, other brownstones, Mr. Lorillard, there were people right there. He brought in artists, including American artists. This is the wonderful fireplace by Augustus St. Gaudens and David Maitland Armstrong that stood in the hallway of the original Vanderbilt house here. It was really quite wonderful. And then they got richer. By now, we've got J.P. Morgan turning what had been old-fashioned family businesses into corporations, buying out the principals. And when this happens, a lot of these people get even richer. And so they expand. And so Cornelius Vanderbilt goes all the way from 57th Street on that corner, all the way to 58th Street in this enormous house. How long do you think that lasts? 30 years? Not quite. It's Bergdorf Goodman today. Vanderbilt daughter houses. And here's Alva's, one of her sons, Willie K. Jr., building an addition in 1906. Why? By this point, we've got a lot of dollar princesses. A lot of people are with Consuelo, living in other countries, producing grandchildren in other countries. Having a house in New York City doesn't help you in business anymore because it's all J.P. Morgan and corporations. What do you need to run a house for besides servants are a problem? Some of them steal, especially if you're away in the winter or in the summer rather. It's not a comfortable world anymore, and New York City is losing its attraction. So why does Willie K. Vanderbilt build this house? How long did that live? He calls in McKim, Eden White. They do this addition. So it looks like this when it's finished. The house goes down in 15 years. All of those workmen, all of this exquisite interior is Comte marble, this is Bloomington, Indiana limestone, but even so, all of this work goes down, and in no recollection I've ever found does anybody say, I hate seeing my house torn down. Never does Alva say anything, never does Consuelo say anything. They just forget about the New York City houses. Asymmetrical to this are the Roosevelts. The Roosevelts have gotten rich now too. They're Dutch families, but they have managed to go into the plate glass business. And as plate glass entrepreneurs, the fact we're building big buildings in Soho with big windows now, and we're going to create skyscrapers with big windows, the Roosevelts are suddenly rich. And what they do is build these 3 houses up on 57th Street. What's unusual about them is they have social causes, abolition, they do a lot of good things, and even in their interiors, does this look different? If you want to see the wonderful Frank Furness interiors of the Roosevelt House, go out to Sagamore Hill in Oyster Bay, Long Island, where much of this has been moved. Okay, we're still going to go up. The park is a mess. What will become the park is a mess. We're looking at the first little house that was built across from the park. The middle of the block was the cheapest lot, and you could make it the thinnest lot. So this is a house, a little Gothic house by Jacob Ray Mould, who did all of the permanent buildings in Central Park. But in a big windstorm, it blew over because it was totally unprotected. The Rockefeller Boswicks started up, and so we have now half the number of the houses because it's only now on the east side of the park as we proceed northward, and we go into a period of intense real estate speculation. The speculation is so bad that there's lots of property disputes, and we see a lot of these signage barriers holding the properties out from people's views, and we see that there's lots of this. In fact, New York Fifth Avenue must have looked at that point like a boxer who'd lost a few of his teeth, because there were all these plywood signs as you went from house to house. And then we go down to Mrs. Astor. Now here's Mrs. Astor, Queen of Society, and this is over. Her brother-in-law and sister-in-law have died. Her nephew hates her. And so what he does before he departs from England is build something on his father's property, which is called the Waldorf Hotel, which casts a really nasty shadow right on Mrs. Astor's house. There it is. What does she do? Capitulates fully. She calls in the Vanderbilt architect, in her eyes, and builds a chateau in the Vanderbilt style, really a change. And she and her son moved to 66th Street and into this amazing house. This is much more of how things really looked at the time, unlike the Roosevelts, but this was too a fraud. Oddly enough, Mrs. Astor died with a lot of fake pearls in her famous pearl necklace, a lot of holes in the tapestry, a lot of holes in the carpets, a lot of worn out furniture. Curiously enough, her Schermerhorn real estate holdings, if they'd held on to them, would have made her much richer than any Astor, because they owned so much property along the waterfront. All right, brownstones continue, streets radiate out, more plywood boards. We keep going up, more houses of grandeur. The city keeps moving forward. I love this one. It's a woman in a little horse cart. And this is the famous Havemeyer house, a really great house. Again, a house that has difficulty figuring out its reason to be, but it had this wonderful interior with the Tiffany hanging staircase and the wonderful paintings. Louisine Havemeyer's friend was a woman called Mary Cassatt, and Mary Cassatt advised her on buying pictures. And thanks for all of us to have that benefaction, because all of this is now in the Metropolitan Museum except the staircase. Okay, we keep going up, everybody's going up. Here's Mr. Lennox's library. It lives for 30 whole years on Lennox's Hill, but it goes over for this. This is, of course, the Frick House. Mr. Frick buys the property from New York City, which is creating a public library on the site of the Croton Reservoir, but he has to wait 10 years to build his house, but he does, and he gets this house. And then we get to the king daddy of all these houses, and the lady wrote me this morning that her family, is that Miss Newman? No? In any case, her grandfather was the architect of it, which is true. This is 102 rooms, a house for the most crooked man Mark Twain had ever met. Also a mine owner and also a U.S. Senator. I'm sure that's a surprise. He lived in this house with his wife, or at this point I'm not even sure he's married to her, and a baby daughter called Huguet. Some of you may remember a couple of years ago, there was a 103-year-old woman who died in Beth Israel Hospital, surrounded by her doll collection, even though she didn't have any illness. That's Huguet. So this is her house. Again, sorry, 102 rooms. There was a swimming pool in the bottom, very unusual in a house. How long do you think this one lasted? Goes down in the 20s. You know, these things just up and down, just thrown away. This is the last of our anchor houses. This is Henry Cook. He bought a whole block, and he was only going to sell to people he trusted. And so he built this really thick, it's rather like the Stewart House, really, really thick, heavy house for he and his family. 20 years later, the Duke House went down for a better styled house for a different purpose. Okay, the property included this wonderful ode to Alva Vanderbilt by C.P.H. Gilbert, which becomes the mode for Brooklyn Heights houses and many houses in New York City. C.P.H. Gilbert becomes the master of this style. 2 blocks away from this is a young girl called Frida Schiff, and she loves this house. And she says when she marries, she wants this house. Here it is in a painting. This is what's going on with the brownstones now. Okay, brownstones are out of style, we don't want them anymore, but the property's good, the property's valuable. Tell you what we're gonna do. We're gonna rip off the brownstone, rip off the stoop, puncture holes in the middle of the house so we can have light wells, go into the back garden so we can make the house a little bit bigger, and put a Beaux-Arts facade on the front of the house. When you go up to the 70s and you look at all those buildings that are embassies and that sort of thing today, it's all this. They're all Beaux-Arts fronts on what had once been brownstones, redone in the early 20th century. We go up to Frick's rival, Mr. Carnegie. They hated each other. Each one wanted a garden. Each one got one. And then we come up to Frida Schiff. Now, Frida Schiff is saying, I'm going to get married to Felix Warburg, and I'm going to build that house. And her father said, it's too showy. It's going to get us bad publicity. But she built it. And this is one of the few houses that remain. It is the Jewish Museum today. The last of the houses. This is the Willard Straight mansion. Willard Straight had an interesting history. He's not part of this world. He comes from upstate New York. His parents were missionaries. They were missionaries in Asia, which means that in Asia, he learned all the languages and the customs of Asia, which for an American was quite unusual by the early 20th century. He made a diplomatic marriage to a daughter of William Collins Whitney, so there was tons of bucks. Rather like the story we just told of Belmont, where the marriage has made his presence, so too Willard Straight, but his own abilities were immense. They built this rather nice, tasteful house. It is still there on 94th Street. It's the last of these houses, and Willard Straight came to a bad end. The government recognized him as very special. And we sent him over to help negotiate the 1918 peace treaty at the end of World War I, where he got, guess what? The Spanish flu, and died. So we lose Willard Straight, which is a great misfortune. Okay, could have gone on to be a very important person in the city. Okay, I'm sorry. All right, so it's over. All those people in funny clothes, in powdered wigs, stuffed with a lot of talcum powder into tights, costume parties, pretense, building things that make you say, oh yes, my family was related to Charlemagne. All of this ends You don't need a house in New York anymore. You don't need this expense anymore. And by the early 20th century, it's just ending. People now live in Greenwich. People live in Oyster Bay. People live in other places. They don't need to keep the New York City house up. And as we see the very, very end of this peculiar time in New York City, but it has brought us to the north. We've come all the way up to the 90s, and New York City is now moving at a fast pace with rich people, and we have the city beginning a form of life we will know, which now has really escaped us. The social register, the Barneys, the debutante balls, it's pretty much over. Do we care about these people? The descendants, where are they? They live in Palm Beach. This way of life where they know each other's great-grandparents. You know, oh, was that ring from your great-grandmother? So it's a whole world, and it's a world that ended, but it created modern New York. Thank you.
Mosette, that was fabulous. You've taken us on a tour of Fifth Avenue from Washington Square Park to the 90s, and it was fabulous. It was so entertaining, but also so extremely informative. So thank you very much. Fabulous talk. But now we'd like to take some questions, both from our in-person audience and from the online audience.
Thanks for a great talk. What role do you see churches playing in the development of Fifth Avenue?
Not much. The churches really follow the people. And the churches we're talking about leap from one area of wealthy people's neighborhood to another area of wealthy people's neighborhood. They don't do much. In the very end, they do. There's a sense in the early days that a lot of these parties and a lot of these goings on enrich the immigrants because they're sewing feathers on the clothes, making the costumes, all that sort of thing. But by the time we get to these guys, the churches are beginning to say this is useless capitalism and this is not a good thing. But in general, the churches have very small roles. What do you do if you're not a church? Where do Jewish robber barons want to go? To the middle of the block, because nobody can stop you there. Or to a brand new block, where you're the first person in, and if people choose to build near you, fine. So there is still the same old prejudices. People are really, the Dutch church was bought out fairly effectively by the Episcopalians, so it's the Episcopal Church and the Presbyterian Church, and the other churches don't have much of a role.
Right, I'm going to ask you an online question.
Sure.
And Mosette, could you also repeat the questions for the online audience?
Sure.
I'm seeing a little trouble with this mic. Why were all those houses built with so little surrounding gardens, especially considering that these families could afford the extra land? Did gardens and space between houses go out of fashion?
Absolutely, it's a very good gardens and space between the houses. The trouble with this is I did this work off and on for decades. And the problem is I want to tell everybody everything, and I'm trying to cut it for this talk. You were perfectly right. It's a wonderful question. Lower Manhattan, in the area below 14th Street, had these gardens and had these spaces between them. The Astors did, between the two Astors in the middle of the 19th century, but nobody else did. You had window boxes. Nobody else did because they had the back gardens, and by the time the grander houses are built, everybody now is beginning to have a summer house. People are starting to leave New York in the summer. Instead of going to the garden in the back of their house, which is where, with the grape leaves, you married off your children to other children in the neighborhood. That's the way it worked in the early 19th century. Now you're going to summer resorts. Now people are going to Newport. They're going to Long Branch. They're going to other places, so they don't need nature in the city.
102 rooms.
William Clark, 102 rooms. The big house on the cover of the book is William Clark. This guy.
Why were they demolishing these houses? Like, I can imagine that if I don't know, no longer want to live somewhere, I can just sell it or just leave the house. So, what were they building when they were demolishing what looks like houses?
New York City's Fifth Avenue in the 1920s would have looked like a large domino game. You know how people work sometimes on a domino run, and they'll put it together for weeks and weeks and weeks, and then they push and it all goes down very slowly? That's what Fifth Avenue looked like in the early 20th century, or in the early 20s, 1920s. Apartment, that's something I didn't bring up. One of the problems with these houses, and one of the problems with gardens, by the way, is tall buildings take the light away. And so that was a big problem in Midtown. The tall office buildings on the now east side of Fifth Avenue by 1905, 1906 are creating a problem. But the issue of the tall buildings on residential properties, there was a man, and you, if anybody lives on Fifth Avenue today, you probably live in one of his buildings, J.E.C. Carpenter, took the Fifth Avenue houses down in 1916, and then in the 1920s, like that domino game, they're going thud, 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 and the few of them that survived World War II went thud, thud, thud in the 1950s. So they become apartment houses. They're getting very expensive. You can't find the servants. They're hard to keep up. And so apartment houses become the mode of Fifth Avenue.
Right, do we have any more questions? Right.
I'm sure there were no elevators, and I noticed
There were.
that in the top of the homes, the windows are smaller, so I'm guessing the servants lived at the top.
Yes, the servants live in the dormers, and then the servants live in the attic floor when the dormers get assumed into the house itself. It must have been very hot for them. They went out, I should hope they could get out to the garden behind the house in the summer. It must have been very, very hot. There were elevators by the 1870s or so. Actually, Mimi, does Lockwood Matthews have an elevator? Yes. By that time period, you're beginning to see this happen. The Villard houses had an elevator. You're beginning to see elevators come in by the 70s. And it will be common when they refront the houses and take them, de-brownstone them. When they turn them into a Beaux-Arts-fronted house, they often insert elevators. So elevators do come in. Do servants have a tough time? Yeah.
Which houses are still standing?
Almost none.
And the Vanderbilt houses, one, two?
Yes, almost everything you see in the picture. The only thing that's standing now is the Jewish Museum, and virtually nothing else exists. If we had had the kind of thinking we have now, we should have prioritized 3 of the houses. We should have said Alva Vanderbilt's Petit Chateau, the white house that Alva built. That should have been saved. William Collins Whitney's remarkable transformation of the Stewart House, I went over it I didn't do it, knew I could see the clock. That should have been saved. And the Havermeyer House should have been saved. And none of them were. It's a tragedy. I don't think there's another city that would have gobbled up these. You know, if your family came over from, let's say, Italy, because so much of the work on these houses were done by Italians, and you could cry as your lifelong career, your family's career was just trashed in one after another. So it's really a tragedy that we let all these go. And we really have nothing much. We have a few isolated ones, as the Lockwood Matthews house. There are a few of them in other parts of the area, but New York City's property, you know, in the 1870s, the properties went from $30,000 an empty lot to $150,000 1870s dollars for an empty lot. It was just too crazy to stop.
Right, following on that question, I'm just going to take a couple more online questions and then we will conclude the program. So, given what you've just said, and this is from Robert online, what is your view, you know, this incredible and constant change, what is your view on preservation today in New York City?
Oh, where's my friend, Mr. Goodwald? I'm not happy with what's going on in preservation in New York City at the moment. It's lost its spirit.
If apartment houses took over in the 20s, when did corporation build office towers in Fifth?
They started building office towers in Fifth as early as 1909. They weren't very big. They were 10 feet maybe, or 10 stories rather. They weren't enormous, but they cast a shadow, and that was a problem. So the Vanderbilts, the Astors, and the Rockefellers had a big problem with shadows coming into their gardens in the back of their house because of that Dutton building, which was 10 whole stories. So it was a big problem. That's partially why they all fled. And what they thought they were doing, which they thought was smart, is we're getting away from Midtown because that's where they're going to build these 10-story buildings. We're going to go all the way up to the 1870s, or to the 70s and the 80s, and then we're going to make the same mistake. Mr. Phipps built a house on 87th Street, and he bought the property all around him. What he didn't buy was Madison Avenue, and somebody built a big apartment house, and that one, for all its that was a very, very elaborate house, and that went down in 15 years because of the shadow from the apartment house on the same streets, 87th Street, on Madison, darkening his porte cochere.
Our final question. Professor Broderick, this is from Bianca Online. Thank you so much for bringing so much love and sharing the Fifth Avenue story of what makes New York City so unique. And out of curiosity, do we know if the families educated their children in the home of tutors?
Yes, we do know. There was a school. There was a lovely little school down at Washington Square where Jenny Jerome seems to have gone. One of the house owners, he did own, on about 8th Street and 5th Avenue, sister, ran the first girls' school, and it was quite a good little proper girls' school at the time, but most children were educated at home. The phenomenon of the Upper East Side children's schools that you all know today, that's of early 20th century. None of the, Miss Lucy Green, her name was, but it didn't survive Lucy Green, or outlive Lucy Green. So we begin to see these stories, but until then, the Rockefellers, for example, not wanting to introduce their children to Episcopalians, spent a lot of time with tutors in the house. Consuelo Vanderbilt was tutored at home. So what you wanted to do, you wanted to have some musical ability. I think neat sewing was kind of out. So you wanted some musical ability. You wanted perfection in the languages. So excellent German and excellent French and poetry. And that's what the girls were taught. And the boys, by the middle of the 19th century, were going to college and going away. There were only two places you could go. You could go to Harvard or you could go to Yale. You couldn't go anywhere else. In fact, when some of the trustees of Columbia had their children want to go to Columbia, they said, no, not to that school. And that was true of NYU too. They were considered very poor quality schools. The boys had to go to Harvard or Yale. And the girls, Barnard does start though. We begin to get girls' colleges about the early 20th century, but everybody was privately tutored until then.
I'm sorry if we didn't get to your question, but you have an opportunity to speak to Mosette afterwards for our in-person audience. Mosette, I just want to thank you for really what it really was absolutely fabulous. It was like you were there in the way that you interpreted what was going on. It was a fabulous presentation. Thank you so much.
Read people's diaries. That's how you get that stuff.
Well, you got the scoop. I think we can say that, and you're just in, endless knowledge about the history and the architecture. I'm going to remind you all that this wonderful book is now available for sale, and I believe Mosette probably sign it for you. For our online audience, it's also available online. You might have heard of this outlet called Amazon. It is available there. And finally, to conclude tonight with a few words from Victoria Dingle, our Executive Director.
Mosette, oh my goodness, listening to you was incredible. And a few things the thoughts were flashing in my mind. Brilliant, scholarly, entertaining, engaging, and really your recall hall is incredible. You embody your topic, and I just had to just peek just to make sure of my comment, and you don't even have any notes. Come on, it's incredible, right?
Yes, absolutely.
No notes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Are
you.
a treasure. Did you grow up in New York?
I lived here my parents had bought a house in a place called Oyster Bay during the war. So we were there in the summers, but when I was 3, my mother came out to find me in my snowsuit covered in roaches. And my mother said, out of New York City. So all I wanted was to come back, which I was lucky enough to do when I was about 19. All I wanted was to come back. So I don't know how the people who've repopulated the suburbs, I didn't live in the suburb, but even so, how the people who've moved out of New York after a couple of years, is that leaf blower driving you a little crazy? Isn't it dark in February? My hope is that we can manage to bring, I think New York City needs a boost of you all. New York City did not come back from COVID well, and I'm very much hoping that we will get normal people with interest in culture and interest in the arts back in the city, and I'm hoping you all will encourage other people to stay. I worry about the future of New York.
Amen.
That will conclude tonight's talk. We've got a little memento for you.
Oh, how
Mosette.
kind, thank you.
Yes. And in-person audience, please join us for a glass of wine. Please come back for our remaining Archtober events. Thank you all so
Thank
much
you.
for attending.
Thank you all
Thank
very
you.
much. You're very kind.
You're so wonderful.